Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Well, thank you, Dr. Kalupa. And my first lesson is the key to effective communication is to keep expectations very low. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I begin with a disclosure, and that is I have never had the opportunity to wear a uniform of any of the armed services of the United States. So I have not served in the military. But perhaps more than most civilians, I do have an affinity for those who wear the uniform. As Dr. Kalupa mentioned, my dad was a professor at West Point. We moved there when I was 2. He was a civilian professor. He stayed there until he passed away on duty 25 years later. He is buried at West Point. I grew up at West Point. For those in the Army or those who know West Point, we lived in the gingerbread house right next to Trophy Point, and my alarm clock was the cannon that would go off at 5:20 in the morning. And on a good day, I could hear the bugles first, but mostly I just heard the cannons. For the last 26 years, I've had the honor to teach and advise the United States Marine Corps. And of all the work I've done in uniform, most of it has been with Marines. I have also been working on a number of joint commands, and I have the honor of teaching 5 or 6 times a year at the Defense Information School in Fort Meade, and that's also one of my favorite things to do. And I've met a bunch of Air Force folks at Fort Meade, and I believe it is because of them that the Air Force came to know of me, and this is my second time with the Air Force. I'm delighted to be here. What I want to share with you today is the fruits of my research and work into communication as an instrument of policy, communication as an instrument that helps us achieve outcomes. And along the way, I want to cover 3 things in the next 40 minutes. The first is foundational principles of leadership communication and the most effective ways that leaders can deploy communication to influence outcomes. The second, I want to use the framework of warfighting as a discipline to help us better understand the ways to use communication effectively. And then finally, I want to leave you with a tool. And it's a tool that will be made available to you afterward in a PDF. And it is also for those who've read my book, The Power of Communication. It is an adaptation of what you will have read in Chapter 2 called Taking Audiences Seriously. It's called an audience engagement checklist. We're going to call it a leadership communication planning checklist. That's what we'll cover between now and 45 minutes after the hour. So let's begin with the core principles. The big takeaway I'd like you to leave the room with is this. Communication has power. Communication has the ability to influence outcomes. Communication has the ability to advance the foreign policy of the United States. Communication has the ability to promote unit cohesion, to promote good relations with allies and with the communities in which you operate. Communication done effectively has the ability to be a force multiplier, to allow you to accomplish more, better, faster than if you don't have effective communication. But all too often, even among people who are strategically focused, there's a tendency to not take communication as seriously as the other instruments of power. And as a result, that communication may dissipate, and the effectiveness may be very, very small. And you get a lot of churn for very little return on that investment. You get a lot of activity, but not a lot of outcome. And sometimes ineffective communication causes self-inflicted harm and actually hurts the foreign policy of the United States, or actually inhibits unit cohesion, or it actually strains relations with allies or with the communities with which we have to engage. Done well, effective communication can move people and move institutions. Think of President Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. Done ineffectively, communication can create friction. And now I look lovingly at the Marine in the second row. And I note that on the day the Marines got to Baghdad, April 10th, 2003, a 20-year-old corporal, on the command of a major, climbed up a piece of equipment and laid an American flag over the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square. It was right in front of the Palestine Hotel. The world's press corps was there. It was captured live on television. And that hurt the interests of the United States. Don't take my word for it. Within 2 minutes, then Major General James Mattis got on the horn with the tank commander and said, "Get that flag off that statue." And it was taken down. It was only up for 2 minutes. But those 2 minutes defined the American arrival into Baghdad. And it was the imagery of an occupying power. It was an image of American triumphalism at a time when the political leadership was saying, we're there for good reasons, not to acquire property or to take over the country. That ineffective piece of communication hurt the interests of the United States. We need to be diligent and recognize that what we do for a living is now witnessed, is now recorded, is now shared, and the people who are best at this are always aware that communication has consequence. Effective communication has positive consequence, ineffective communication has negative consequence. I'd like to focus on communication as a discipline of leadership. And of all the ways to understand leadership, the one that I've always found most appealing is a definition by late General and President Dwight Eisenhower, who said that leadership consists of getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. Getting those who matter to you to want to do what you want them to do is a core leadership discipline. And to quote one of then General Eisenhower's colleagues in the prosecution of the war in Europe, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the difference between management and leadership is communication. The difference between management and leadership is communication, and leadership is the process of getting those who matter to you to do what you want them to do because they want to. So I begin by noting that communication is an essential discipline of leadership. And like any other discipline, there is a rigor to effective communication. There is a rigor to doing communication well. And it is a rigor that is equivalent to the rigor that you use in every other process you deploy in your work. What I often find baffling in civilian life and in military life is that leaders who use rigor in every other element of their work throw rigor to the wind when it's time to communicate. And they improvise, or they react on impulse, and then they're surprised that it doesn't go well. And as a leadership discipline, we need to recognize that there is a rigor to doing communication effectively. And today I want to share some of that rigor. Let me note that I became a professor at New York University 29 years ago. And when I was initially hired to teach graduate students in public relations, the industry had pleaded with NYU to please find some way to make the communicators able to think strategically. So my mission when I went into NYU was to teach strategy to communicators. Since then, I spent as much time teaching communication to strategists. But whether I'm teaching strategy to communicators or communication to strategists, the principles are pretty similar. Now, in 1988, when I started teaching, there was no available reference book on strategy in communication. There now is. It's called The Power of Communication, the book that you guys, some of you, are reading. But back then, there was no text on strategy and communication. So I decided to not have to worry about a text on strategy and communication. They already knew communication. I would teach them strategy. But there weren't a lot of books on strategy in 1988 either. So I assigned to the public relations graduate students at New York University On War by Karl von Clausewitz. I can confess that I was not a very popular professor when they opened the book and saw first that it was 700 and something pages. And I offer this as lovingly to our German allies. It was written in a very dense 19th century German style. Even in American translation, it was a bit inaccessible. But to their credit, they read it. And there were a number of principles of Clausewitz that we were able to immediately deploy in the professional practice of communication. And there are two principles in particular that we were able to deploy. And the first is the principle of the objective. And one of my complaints at the time about public relations, it was all about activity, but not about aligning that activity with purpose. And so I was able to just take one word or two words in the principle of the objective, and by just modifying that principle with a couple of word changes, make it apply to the professional practice of communication. And the principle of the objective, as you know, is that war is the continuation of policy by other means, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes. When we think about it, communication is merely the continuation of business by other means, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes. In a military context, I would argue that communication is the continuation of policy by yet other means. And because means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes, the only effective way to measure communication is to ask, does it move us closer and closer to achieving our purpose? And if there isn't clarity of purpose, my advice to my civilian clients, my advice to my military clients, if you don't have clarity about purpose, don't communicate. If you don't have clarity about purpose, don't communicate. Let me share a story. I have no idea whether this applies in the military. I'll know by your smiles or eye contact whether it does. I am often brought into an organization, a company, an NGO, a government, and I'll be asked to assess their communication. And I'll be given something to assess, usually by someone very proud of their work product. So, for example, a weekly newsletter. And I'll be asked, what do you think? And I look at it, and I can see right away that it is well designed, the font is readable, the photographs are compelling. When I read it, the prose is quite legible, quite easy to follow. And then I will ask this question: what is the purpose of this newsletter? I already see a smile now. And I'll get the answer: we send it to our employees on Tuesdays. Thank you, Dean. We send it to our employees on Tuesdays. And I'll say, yeah, okay, I get that. But what's it for? And they'll say, well, it's for employees to get on Tuesdays. And I'll ask the same kind of question a few more times, and I'll always get Tuesday as the response. And eventually I scratch my head. And I say, I don't think Tuesday is a purpose. I don't believe that Tuesday is a purpose. Now, if you tell me that employee productivity is low, and if you tell me that an employee engagement survey has uncovered that employees feel very demoralized because they don't know what's going on in the company, they don't think the company cares about them, then I can say, okay, I get it. This newsletter is intended to have employees learn what's going on and see all the things that the company's doing to make them think that the company cares. I can understand that purpose. And then I can assess the likelihood that this instrument is going to get us closer and closer to that purpose. But Tuesday is never a purpose. I know there's some equivalent in the military. If you can't articulate a purpose that doesn't make reference to the communication itself, my advice is don't communicate. Only communicate when you have a purpose. only communicate when that purpose is clear, and only communicate in ways that move you closer and closer to the achievement of that purpose. Because means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes, and communication is merely the continuation of policy by yet other means. The second principle, I'm sorry, let me take one step back. If we take seriously that communication is the continuation of policy by yet other means, and that you only communicate for a purpose, we then move to the second principle of Clausewitz that my graduate students 29 years ago began to understand, and I offer it to you as well. In On War, Clausewitz describes war as an act of will that is directed toward a living entity that reacts. Just as with the principle of the objective, by changing just a couple of words, we can also have a really good understanding of effective communication. And that is, communication is an act of will that is directed toward a living entity that reacts. And we can parse this definition very precisely. So let's do that. The first is, communication is an act of will. It is always done on purpose. It is always done for a purpose. It is never done impulsively. It is never done improvisationally. It is never done out of personal preference. But it is always done because it helps us move closer and closer towards the accomplishment of a goal. Second element of this definition, directed toward a living entity. Those with whom we communicate are living, breathing human beings. They have their own attention spans. They have their own levels of understanding and sophistication. They have their own capacities. And we need to recognize that all whom we engage are living, breathing human beings. They are not a collective mass called an audience. And communication doesn't consist of pushing stuff at them. Communication consists of connecting with them, of engaging with them, of moving them. And if we think of communication as sending stuff, then we fail. We need to see communication as connecting with people and then moving them with us. Those with whom we connect are living, breathing human beings that react. And so the way to assess whether communication was successful is, did we get the reaction we had hoped? Does this reaction help us advance towards our goal? Or was there no reaction? Or was the reaction insufficient to move us towards the goal? Because means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes, and communication is merely a means. Communication is an act of will directed towards a living entity that reacts, and we need to take that reaction seriously as a measure of whether we succeed. In the Talmud it is said, I have learned much from my teachers, but from my colleagues I have learned more than from my teachers. But from my students, I have learned the most of all. And I abide by that. It is from my students that I have learned the most of all. And beginning in 2004, 2005, just as Iraq was getting pretty nasty, I had the privilege and the honor of teaching at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College in Quantico, Virginia. And I was teaching a workshop very much like this. And during a break, I wandered down to the Marine Corps bookstore, and I was delighted to see something in the Marine Corps bookstore called the Commandant's Reading List. And number one, as a teacher, I was quite taken that the Commandant has a reading list. Isn't that cool? And number two, I started looking at the 100 titles in that reading list, and I discovered at least a third of them were sharply critical of the U.S. military and of the war in Iraq. And I thought it was really cool that the Commandant was having people read books that were critical of the U.S. military and critical of the war in Iraq. But then I noticed that there were some things on that reading list that were unrelated to what was happening in the world that day, but were foundational principles. And one of the things I found, which I'd never known before, is a slim little volume with a civilian title, Warfighting. The Marines will call it MCDP-1. And Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication number 1, called Warfighting, is in many ways, Colonel, keep me honest here, the first principles of being a Marine. It's the first thing you read when you become a Marine. The foundation. Thank you, sir. I, standing in that bookstore, started flipping through it, and I was immediately very excited. I was excited because, remarkably, it's very well written. And I don't expect that from a military manual. Sorry. And as I'm reading, I'm saying, this is really well written. Whoever wrote this needs to be acknowledged because it's really compelling stuff. It was essentially Clausewitz distilled into accessible English language stuff. I thought that was really cool too. The second thing I noticed is it's relatively short. You can read it in an hour. The third thing I noticed is, just as with Clausewitz, if you change just a couple of words, you can get a conceptual framework that makes sense of communication. And I embarked on a project to do just that. So I came back to NYU, and I teach a course on communication strategy. It's taught over 7 Saturdays from 9 to 5. You get an entire semester over 7 Saturdays. And I required that my graduate students read Warfighting, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication number 1, before the first class. Now, this is New York University, in Greenwich Village, in 2005. And when I submitted the syllabus, I got a call from my department chair who said, "What the heck is this? Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication, Warfighting? You're going to teach this to our communication students?" I said, "Yep." We argued. I won. And on the first day of class, the students arrived. They were what you would expect graduate students in Greenwich Village to look like. Some of them had interesting hair of many colors. A lot of them had metal objects in their cheeks and lips and nose and other parts of their face. And as they all assembled, I began by asking a question. How many, on seeing the syllabus and seeing that the first reading was a Marine Corps publication called Warfighting, were confused? Raise your hand. Every hand went up. I said, how many of you were concerned? Half the hands stayed up. I said, how many of you were angry? A third of the hands stayed up. So I found the most counterculture seeming student, the one with multicolored hair and a lot of hardware in her cheeks. And I called on her and said, "You were angry." And she stood up and she looked at me and she said, "Yes, I was angry." I said, "Tell me why you were angry." She said, "I thought you were going to be feeding us pro-war, pro-Bush propaganda." I said, "Oh, okay. Have you read it?" I said, "Yes, I have." "Are you still angry?" She said, "No, I love this book. I've given copies of this book to my friends and to my family. I want to know why we didn't have this book when we started in the program." Foundations. She said, "I learned more from this book than from all the other courses I've taken so far." Way to go. I knew I was on to something, and I started teaching warfighting not only at NYU, but with civilian clients, with big banks, with big insurance companies, with big pharmaceutical companies. They all got it. They all got it in one. In 2009, I got permission from the Department of the Navy to adapt warfighting. And the power of communication is the result of that permission. So here's what I learned from warfighting. Oh, by the way, that student with the hair and the hardware, her hair now looks like anybody else's hair, I say, as someone without hair. And she no longer wears hardware in her cheeks, and she's now a professor of strategic communication at New York University. All this many years later, warfighting actually changed her. Warfighting changed her in profound ways. Here's the first paragraph of Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication war fighting. War is fundamentally an interactive social process. When I put that on the wall of a civilian institution, they all look at that and they go, wow, that's really cool. That the Marines define war as fundamentally an interactive social process. Communication is also fundamentally an interactive social process. One of the more effective ways to understand communication is that it is interactive, it is social, and it is a process. It's not sending stuff. It's fundamentally an interactive social process. As with war, communication is thus a process of continuous mutual adaptation, of give and take, of move and countermove. As in war, just as we need to keep in mind that the enemy is not an inanimate object to be acted upon, in communication we need to keep in mind that the audience is not an inanimate object to be acted upon, but a collection of living, breathing human beings with their own desires, their own goals, their own plans, their own capacities, their own levels of desire, even to be in relationship with us. And we fail as leaders if we assume that just telling people stuff is what communication is all about. Just as it's essential in war to understand the enemy on its own terms and to not assume that the enemy thinks as we do and cares about what we care about and makes decisions the way we make decisions, similarly in communication, we should not assume that the audience thinks the way we think or cares about what we care about or makes decisions the way we do. They don't. And ineffective leaders assume that others are just like them, but the effective leaders know that others are not like them. And if we want to connect with and move people, we need to meet them where they are. We need to think the way they think. We need to understand their concerns on their terms, or else we can't possibly begin to move them. We must try to put ourselves and see ourselves through their eyes in order to anticipate what they are likely to do. If communication is an act of will directed towards a living entity that reacts, we need to be able to anticipate the reaction that is predictable and likely because we engage with them. And we make decisions in light of the audience's anticipated reactions and counteractions. In other words, we engage them because we predictably know that doing it in a certain way leads to a certain outcome. Or per warfighting, we ask ourselves these questions. Which factors matter most to our audience? Which does the audience care the most about? Which, if harnessed effectively, will bring the audience to think and feel and know and do what we want them to? How do we connect with them about that? Effective communication is hard because it forces us to ask these kinds of questions. And the most effective decisions in preparing communication are decisions that get us to connect with audiences on the terms the audiences care about and not based on our own personal preference. And that's a hard discipline. So let's move on to how you can begin to deploy this rigor, how you can begin to deploy this discipline in all of your leadership communication, whether among your own folks or with others with whom you operate, or with allies, or with communities, or with congressional committees, or with the bosses in the Pentagon. How do you deploy this rigor in order to move people a certain way? And I begin with this fundamental premise. The only reason to communicate is to change something in the people you're engaging. The only reason to communicate is to change something in the people that you are engaging. And there are four kinds of changes that we can typically see in the people we are engaging. The first, we can change what people know so that they know something they otherwise would not have known. Or we can change what people think so that they think something they otherwise would not have thought. Or we can change what people feel so that they feel something they otherwise would not have felt. Or we can change what people do so that they do something they otherwise would not have done. And we can have multiple configurations and combinations of these 4 changes. And here's why the discipline matters. If we want to change what somebody knows, we need to engage completely differently than if we're trying to change what somebody feels. It takes a different kind of engagement to change what somebody feels compared to changing what somebody knows. If we want to change simultaneously what they know and feel, it takes both of those things. And until we have clarity about the change we seek, it's really hard to calibrate the ways to secure that change. And because means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes, until we have clarity about the change we seek, it's really hard to predictably be able to do it in an effective and efficient way. If we wanted to do all 4 of these changes, it takes even more. And the discipline is having clarity about the change we seek, and then getting clarity about how to move the people in order to achieve that change. So I'm going to share with you now a tool. I'm going to share with you a method, and you'll get this in writing, and you'll be able to use this tool to prepare communication. You can use this tool to prepare communication to an audience of 1. You're briefing the commander, you're briefing the boss, you're briefing the president, you're briefing the Secretary of Defense. You can use this planning tool to prepare to communicate with an audience of 1. You can use this planning tool to prepare to communicate with an audience of dozens, with an audience of hundreds, with an audience of millions. The planning tool doesn't change. It's the level of detail and the number of iterations you need that changes based on how big the audience and how heterogeneous the audience may be. But the planning tool doesn't change. And if we are serious about influencing outcomes through communication, then there's a 5-step process to getting ready to communicate. There's a 5-step process for getting ready to communicate. And most ineffective communicators, and therefore most purported leaders, typically begin at step 5. Typically begin at the 5th step, and they never consider the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th. And I'd like you to imagine whatever rigorous process you do in your primary occupation. And I'm going to ask you what happens if you start on the last step in preparing your work compared to starting on the 1st step when you're starting your work. And my prediction is it won't go very well. So we need to start at the 1st step. And then we need to move to the 2nd step. And we can't skip steps. It's only after the 2nd we move to the 3rd. It's only after the 3rd we move to the 4th. And by the way, the 4th is the really hard one. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd are pretty easy. 4th is really hard. We'll get to that in a minute. So what are those steps? The first is to have clarity of purpose. Because communication is the continuation of policy by yet other means, until we have clarity about the purpose to achieve the policy, it's going to be very hard to effectively plan that communication. The 2nd step is the people. Who is it that we need to engage in order to move towards the fulfillment of that purpose? And the discipline is to write it down. The discipline is to not do this informally, but to write it down. 3rd step. What is the change you seek in the people you hope to move? And again, the discipline is to write it down. These 3 steps are relatively easy. These 3 steps are very straightforward. All it requires is clear thinking, a little bit of insight, but it doesn't take a lot of time and it doesn't really take a lot of work. What takes time and takes work is the fourth step, and that is figure out as much as you can about what matters to the people you're trying to influence. Figure out as much as you can about the people you're trying to influence, and there's a series of questions you can ask that get you quickly to at least an understanding of the content you need, of the understanding you need, and we're going to go through those questions in a moment. It is only after you've done those four steps that you are in any way ready to then prepare the mechanics of the communication. Most people begin at step 5, and most people these days begin step 5 with a PowerPoint deck. I see some smiles. If you begin step 5 with PowerPoint, the likelihood is very high that you're not going to successfully move people. It's not that there's anything wrong with PowerPoint, but it shouldn't be the first thing you move to. It shouldn't be your first resort. And I also offer as lovingly as I can that the term is PowerPoint, not every point. Yeah, you're welcome for that. You can have that. Yeah. But all too often, we present something we call a PowerPoint, and it really is every point. And what is the likelihood that that every point actually achieves your purpose? Thank you, ma'am. I see a very sad shaking of the head. So let's go through these one at a time. The first, what is the goal that the communication you plan is intended to achieve, and you have to state it in terms that have nothing to do with the communication. Tuesday is not a purpose. So what is the policy goal that you're hoping to attain? And get as much granularity as you can and write it down, because everything else is going to be measured against the likelihood that it will move you closer to this policy goal. Because means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes. This is the purpose. And we measure against the achievement of purpose. That's not hard, but it requires clear thinking and discernment. The second is to think about the people. Think about the people who matter. The people who can move you either directly or indirectly or right away or through a series of interactions closer and closer to the fulfillment of that purpose. And write them down. And if there are multiple categories, write down each of those categories. And if there's really important nuances of difference even within categories, write those down. Have as much granularity about how heterogeneous your audience may be, because if it's heterogeneous, you're going to have to connect with each subset on its own terms, and that just means the communication has to be far more robust. The good news is the people for whom something doesn't matter will ignore it when you say it, but the people who do need to hear a certain thing will notice it when you say something that connects with them. So if you've got 17 different subsets you need to connect with, so long as you have something for each of the 17, they will likely hear what they need to hear, and the other folks will ignore all of that other stuff. But if we have 17 subsets, we need to be able to connect in 17 different ways. That's hard. But it begins with having clarity about what the heterogeneity in our audience may be. The third step is to target the change in each of those subsets of audience. And we target each subset of audience by asking very basically, when we're done, how do you want them to change? What do you want them to know because you engaged them that they otherwise would not have known? Write that down. The discipline is to write it down. What do you want them to think that but for your engagement with them they would not have thought? What do you want them to feel that but for your engagement with them they would not have felt? And then finally, what do you want them to do that but for your engagement with them, they would not otherwise have done. And you need to answer this question for each subset of audience. And this is where it gets a little complicated. This is where your ability to manage very complex systems comes in handy. But what will work for one group will probably not work for another group. So you have to have clarity about each of the groups before you figure out what is likely to work for each of them. As I said, these first 3 steps are relatively easy. It just requires clear thinking and careful discernment. It's the 4th step that is really hard. And in this 4th step, we ask about each of those subsets of audience. First, what do they care about? And there are 4 kinds of questions we can ask that gets to what do they care about. The first is, what are their values? What do they as a group have in common about the things that motivate them day in and day out? What are their values? The second, what are their long-term hopes? What are their aspirations? What do they work towards? The third, what are their fears? What are their deep fears? What are their surface anxieties? And it's critically important to inventory their fears. It's critically important to inventory their anxieties, because those fears and anxieties are barriers. And if we don't have clarity about the fears and anxieties, we may miss a barrier, and we may end up throwing communication at something that isn't going to get through. But we can also use those fears and anxieties as motivators, because we can resolve the fears and we can resolve the anxieties. And then finally, what are their short-term wants? What are their short-term wants in the immediate term? The more clarity we have about values, about long-term hopes, about fears and anxieties, and about short-term wants, the more likely we are to figure out how to connect with them on the things they care about. But we're not done. First is we need to do this for every subset. So the more heterogeneous the audience, the more of this work we have to do. And one of the consequences of this planning is we may conclude that we shouldn't try to connect with all of these subgroups at the same time. We may conclude that it's just too complicated, or that things cancel each other out, and that's a good outcome of the planning tool. If the planning tool outcome is, ooh, maybe I shouldn't do this communication the way I had planned, or the way I thought I would do it, then that's a good outcome. Maybe you need 2 different forms of communication, 2 different subsets of this audience. Or you may need 4 or 9, but you won't know that until you go through this 4th part of the audience analysis. If the hopes, fears, values, and desires are so different among the subsets of these groups that there's no one communication that can actually achieve all of them, then split it into multiple communications. We're not done, though. We then need to ask, how does this audience choose? How do they make decisions? Do they need evidence? If so, you'd better have evidence. Do they need logic? If so, you'd better have logic. Do they need emotional resonance? If so, you'd better have emotional resonance. Do they need third-party validation? If so, you'd better have a third-party validator. Do they need someone they deeply trust to be the messenger? Then you need to identify that they need somebody they deeply trust to be the messenger, and it may not be you, and you need to know that in advance. Because if you don't ask that question, you might end up being the one to communicate and they don't trust you, in which case that communication isn't likely to work. So how do they make choices? If you're presenting to a committee and you want the outcome to be the approval of something, how does the committee decide? Is it a vote? Do they need consensus? Is it a majority? Is it a simple majority? Is it only the illusion of a vote, but if there's one person in the room who actually makes the decision, but wants other people to believe they have a role in that decision, the more clarity you can have about how any particular group decides, the more likely you are to actually be able to connect with them. And then the last set of questions, and this is the one that most communicators fail, most leaders fail to ask, and that is, what will prevent them? What will prevent them from thinking, feeling, knowing, doing? What are the barriers? Some of the barriers are physical. They can't hear us, they can't see us. And in my corporate work, I often say to my corporate clients that the single most prevalent form of business communication is also the least effective, and that is the conference call. And I see some of you smiling and nodding your head. I've not been on any military conference call, so I can't judge military conference calls. But I can say this about the conference calls I've experienced. There's a dirty little secret in conference calls. And that dirty little secret is this. Every single person on the end of the call is doing something else while you're talking, including you. The dirty little secret of the conference call is everyone on the call is trying to be efficient and do other stuff because they're really busy. And as a result, they're really not paying attention to whoever is speaking. And that's a barrier. And if you're going to be engaging through a large number of people on the same phone call, unless you adapt how you engage them, they're not going to hear what you have to say. Because there's another dirty little secret, and that's this. There is no such thing as multitasking. There is only the illusion of multitasking. There is serially tasking in microbursts. So when you're doing this, while purportedly listening on a conference call, you really aren't hearing what's happening on the conference call. So one of the ways that an effective leader on a conference call adapts is recognizing that everybody's doing this while he or she is speaking, to not say anything important without saying you're about to say something important. So the next thing we need to really focus on is everybody stops typing and looks up. And then you say it, they nod their head, then they go back to typing. Until you acknowledge that the conference call is a barrier, you will not know to adapt on the conference call. But you need to acknowledge that the conference call is a barrier. There are other barriers. There's the barrier of natural language. You may be speaking to people for whom English is not the first language. By the way, I'm one of those. I've gotten pretty good at it over the years, but I came here not speaking a word of English. And I sometimes still have difficulty with American slang. So now let me notice we have allies in the room. Let me also speak lovingly to the Americans in the room. No one else knows anything about American baseball. Please stop using American baseball metaphors on phone calls. They just don't know what you're talking about. So, we're at the bottom of the ninth. What the heck is that? And now let me say, I'm from Colonel Regis's country. I am a Brazilian. I'm a proud Brazilian. And we Brazilians know that footballs are shaped like balls. And they're moved with a foot. And just as with American baseball, most of our allies don't know a thing about American football. So it's third down. Nobody knows what that means. No one has a clue what that means except Americans and Canadians. We need to recognize that when we're speaking to people from other cultures with other languages, American sports metaphors aren't very helpful, but they're very commonly used. And we need to see that as a barrier. We need to find ways to speak that doesn't assume an intimate knowledge of peculiarly American institutions. And that's a barrier. And we need to recognize that barrier, and we need to adapt in order to prevent that misunderstanding. Another barrier. We may not be trusted, and lack of trust is a barrier. And we need to think really carefully about whether there is someone who is trusted. Or, in the absence of trust, what can we do to make it more likely that they will believe what we have to say? But until we identify that lack of trust is a barrier, we're unlikely to adapt in ways that get people to actually want to hear what we have to say. So there are physical barriers, technology. There are cultural barriers, including language and particular cultural vocabulary. There's also the issue of the TLAs. You know what the TLAs are. Those are the three-letter acronyms. Yeah, you can let that sink in. Yeah, there's TLAs, those are the three-letter acronyms. There's also the FLAs, the four-letter acronyms, which are not to be confused with the FLAs, which is the five-letter acronyms. And it's not unique to people in uniform, but there's a tendency to use a lot of acronyms, and there's a tendency to assume that the other people we're talking to know exactly what those acronyms mean, and I'm here to attest we don't. So it's important not to default to acronym talk, but we do it all the time in small groups. When we do it in heterogeneous groups, the likelihood of misunderstanding is very, very high. So the effective leader takes these barriers very seriously. The effective leader honors these barriers. I'm going to say that again. The effective leader honors the barriers and then asks, can these barriers be overcome? Can these barriers be overcome? And if the answer is no, my counsel is don't communicate. If the answer to the question, can these barriers be overcome, is no, then I have to wonder, why the heck would you want to communicate? If the barrier is so severe that your message will not get through to the people whom you're trying to move, and they will not be moved, and they will not think, feel, know, and do what you need them to, then why go through the trouble and confuse people or squander resources, including your valuable time? Once you figure out whether the barrier can be overcome, you then ask, how do we overcome it? The most effective way to overcome it is to adapt the way you were planning to engage. But if you conclude you can't overcome it, don't communicate. Imagine how much more time you would have if you didn't get swamped by ineffective communication. Imagine how much more time you would have if you didn't have to go to a bunch of meetings where the purpose wasn't clear and where the outcome wasn't determined. The effective leader uses communication to move processes forward, not just to speak or send something because it happens to be a particular day in the calendar. It is only when you've done these 4 steps that you are anywhere close to being able to actually prepare communication. And that's the 5th step. The 5th step, given what you learned in steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, but particularly given what you learned in step 4, you then ask, what do the people who matter to us need to see, need to hear? What do they need to experience? What do they need to participate in if they are to know and think and feel and do what you want them to? So what do they need to do? What do they need to see? What do they need to hear? What do they need to experience? What do they need to participate in order to change the way you want them to change? Write that down. And then ask, given what they need to experience, who is the most influential person that will cause them to experience that? And you may conclude that the person you had initially thought would be doing the communication is not the right person to communicate. It may be someone down the chain of command, and maybe somebody across the chain of command, but it may not be you. And that's okay, because it's never about you. Leadership is never about you. It's about moving others to do and think and feel and know what you need them to. Given who the most influential person then is, then what's the most influential thing to be said, either in writing or in person or in some other form? What is the most influential message that will get people to experience what you need them to experience? And then finally, what is the most effective medium through which they ought to experience it? And one of the things we find is a meeting that was initially thought to be a town hall meeting, we're going to talk to all of our people at the same time, by the time you go through this analysis, you realize maybe talking to all of our people at the same time is not the most effective way. Maybe we need to get an immediate supervisor to talk to just their smaller team. And you get clarity about what's likely to work. And you change the medium through which you were going to do it and the person through whom you were going to do it because you've gone through those previous 4 steps. And sir, I saw a vigorous nod when I said that. Does that seem to resonate with you? Yeah. If you do fewer big meetings and more small meetings, what is the consequence? Oh, by the way, usually it's pretty good. There are good reasons to have big meetings, there are good reasons to have small meetings, but Tuesday is never a good reason. Just the calendar is never a good reason. There has to be a predictable outcome that is the optimal outcome from that form of engagement. And it's only when you've done all of that that you then have the ability to actually figure out, what do we need? Do we need PowerPoint? Okay, at this point you can ask the question, do we need PowerPoint? Do we have the ability to generate that PowerPoint? Can we generate PowerPoint so that it only creates the experience we need them to experience up in the first part of step 5? What else do we need? How do we organize? How do we mobilize? How do we prepare? Most communication that is done unstrategically, ineffectively, starts here. And we need to start at the beginning and move our way down. When we follow the sequence, we end up having much more predictably productive communication. There is a rigor to doing it right. And that rigor means we always start with purpose, we then move to people, we then move to the change in the people, and then the hard work is figuring out what matters to those people. And it's only when we figure that out do we then move to, okay, how do we actually organize the communication? Yes, feel free to take that photograph. Thank you. You'll also get a piece of paper or an electronic version of a piece of paper when all of this is done. The Irish poet and playwright George Bernard Shaw. You may know George Bernard Shaw as the playwright who wrote the play Pygmalion. It's all about language. It was then adapted for the movies, for the Broadway and for the movies, as My Fair Lady. George Bernard Shaw says, there is a fundamental challenge of all communication. And he said the biggest challenge of communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Yes, you can have that one too. The illusion that communication has taken place. And I get complaints all the time from senior people on Wall Street, senior people in banking, senior people in healthcare, senior people in uniform. And the complaint I get all the time is, I've told them this. I've told them this. Why aren't they doing what I want them to do? And my answer is, telling them isn't enough. Don't assume that telling them is communication. That you need to engage them. You can't move people until you meet people where they are, and telling people stuff isn't an effective form of communication if all you're doing is telling based on what you want to say. The leadership discipline is saying what you want to say is self-indulgent. Saying what you want to say is selfish, and saying what you want to say is an abrogation of leadership. Effective leaders are rigorous in their communication, not impulsive, not informal, and they don't communicate out of personal preference. They communicate because the outcome is the most likely outcome. The outcome they seek is more likely to be achieved because they communicated with people in a certain way. Communication is the continuation of policy by yet other means, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes. Communication is an act of will directed toward a living entity that reacts, and we have to organize our interaction with that living entity in order to provoke the reaction we want. When we do that, we harness the power of communication effectively. When we do that, we avoid the dissipation of that power that leads to lots of churn and very little return on investment. When we do that, we avoid self-inflicted harm. That's what I came to share with you today. I know I'll be meeting with some of you in your smaller meetings later on. We have 3 minutes and 45 seconds available for questions. And I'll take more questions upstairs. But I'd be happy to take question, comments, complaints, disagreements, whatever you have to offer. Just ask you to raise your hand, and I'll be happy to take whatever you throw at me. Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir. Commander James, submarine warfare officer. I'd like to hear your recommendations on how to combat the natural impulse to be the messenger to the message, to provide credibility to outside observers, vice what you discussed in step 5 of who is the best messenger for the internal credibility.
I give you great credit for having written down something about step 5. That's great. The question was, and keep me honest here, how do I or how does one, okay, how does the leader resist the impulse to say, I'm the leader and therefore I ought to be the one speaking? Okay. In the book, I quote a Wall Street Journal columnist named Holman Jenkins. He wrote this about CEOs, but it applies to any person in a position of authority. He says, organizations need defenses against their charismatic leaders. That one seems to strike home. He says, otherwise, those leaders can all too readily bully or seduce others into supporting their vainglorious illusions. You come from a very hierarchical background where those kinds of defenses against charismatic leaders are a little more challenging than in civilian life. To the degree that there's someone withstanding to look at the boss and say, boss, I know you want to exercise your leadership authority and be the primary messenger of this, but we have done the research and we have concluded that the change we are hoping to see is more likely if someone else, someone other than you, says it. Or says it in a different sequence. If someone other than you says it, you endorse it. Or you introduce it, somebody else makes the case, and you close it. But what is the optimal outcome we seek, and what is the best way to get that? One of the things I find is when you have done some form of rigorous analysis, and when the boss has already agreed that that analysis is appropriate. So if you say, sir, ma'am, I'd like to prepare to make my recommendation to you on the most optimal way to achieve this outcome, and then you have the analysis, that structured analysis makes courage less necessary. That structured analysis makes it less likely that someone will impulsively push back and say, no, I'm the boss. I'm going to do this. Now, sometimes they will. Sometimes they will. When I prepare the public affairs officers at Defense Information School, one of the things I prepare them for is that their job is to be able to predict the future. And as Yogi Berra said, making predictions is hard, especially when they're about the future. But they can predict the future about how stakeholders are likely to react, because PAOs are experts in stakeholder reaction. So when the boss says, no, I'm going to do it this way, there's a way to say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I'll support that. But we need to be aware that the likely consequence of that is X. If later the boss can see, without somebody saying, see, I told you so, but if later the boss can see, you know, that guy, he actually was able to predict the future. Maybe I shouldn't have been the one to say this. It takes a little bit of humility. And I know that's in very high supply at the senior-most ranks. But it takes a little bit of humility to be able to see that, but it doesn't take a lot of humility to be able to see that. So one of the things that I point to is the planning makes it more likely that the boss can be asked, does this actually get us to the outcome you seek, sir, ma'am? The other is, if they say, well, I'm going to do it my way anyway, is to be able to at least register the likely consequence and see if that consequence comes true. The final thing I always ask my clients and I suggest that this be a way to think about it, is to never invite the boss to decide based on personal preference, but to always ask the boss to decide based on the predictable outcome. Sir, we have options. We can do it with you as the primary speaker. We can anticipate what that reaction will be. We can do it with so-and-so as the primary speaker. And we can predict what the likely outcomes will be, and we can do it with someone else as the primary speaker, and we can predict what those outcomes will be. Sir, ma'am, which of these outcomes gets us closer to the goal we're trying to achieve? And if you can get the boss to choose based on the likely outcomes, then you're not challenging the boss's authority. You're helping the boss make a smarter decision. It is now 2 minutes and 2 seconds past our scheduled adjournment, and I want to honor your time. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to getting to know you upstairs. Thank you. Yeah.
So in tradition with the Air War College, we want to thank you very much for coming and presenting to us. You've given us some great takeaways. We're always interested in outside perspectives, and a checklist is something that's great for us to take away.
Thank you.
So we would like to coin you and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Academic Year 18.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all.